Alright, hello once again, Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and I've been going over the PowerPoint presentations for Murachs, JavaScript, and jQuery 3rd edition, which is part of the AWD Application and Web Development 1000 Web Technologies class. I'm smack dab in the middle of the 18th and last chapter of the book, and we're about to talk about the module pattern. Now, they mention here on page 560 that many developers and third-party libraries use the module pattern, which uses an IIFE or an IIFE to create a single instance of an object that has private state. So the first thing they talk about in here is they get into talking about the fact that using a single instance is basically using what's called a singleton, S-I-N-G-L-E-T-O-N, and a singleton is a pattern in which you have only one instance of an object. The easiest way to do this in JavaScript is using an object literal. In the task list we did back in the previous chapter, we had a single object that was in charge of all the operations for working with all of the tasks in our task list application. All right. A singleton is created when the file that contains it loads and there's no way to create a second one. The problem with object literals, though, is that they can't have private state. You can overcome this problem by using a function to create a closure with private state, but this means that you can create multiple instances of the object by making multiple calls to the function that produces it. Well, what the module pattern does is it allows you to combine the benefits of object literals with the benefits of closures. It uses an IIFE to create a single instance of the object that's returned by a function that creates the closure, which can be referred to as a module. That way you get a single instance of an object, but said object has private state. The first example here shows how this works. The slideshow library has been rewritten to use an IIFE with private state that returns an object that refers to that private state. Since it's immediately invoked, it doesn't need to be called to create the object. Rather, a global slideshow variable will contain the object returned by the IIFE as soon as the library loads and the IIFE runs. And very similar to an object literal, you can overwrite it, but you can't create a second instance of it. So the module pattern is often used in conjunction with what are called namespaces. A namespace lets you keep your objects out of the global namespace, which helps avoid name collisions with other libraries. If you want to create a namespace, you assign an object literal to a variable. Then you add the IIFE to the object. Okay, and this module pattern is also fairly easy to augment, so you can split the code for an object into multiple files. You'd probably want to do this if you had a large code base or you had multiple programmers that were working on the same file. In fact, that's what they show you right here. In this first example, the figure imports the myapp.slideshow module that was created in the previous figure by passing it as an argument to an IIFE. Once a method has been added to a module, it can be used like any other method. And that's what the second example here shows. But a drawback of distributing the code for a module across several files is that you have to make private state public if you want to be able to work with it. Okay, one way around this is to use accessor properties. An accessor property is not the actual location of a property's value. Rather, it contains a getter and a setter, like you see right here. These can read and write the property's data. An accessor property with a getter, with only a getter, is read-only, and one with only a setter is write-only. Finally, the last example, I guess, that's in here shows how to add an accessor named interval to the slideshow object. So they go back and again rebuild the slideshow app, this time using the module pattern. So this adds a button that changes the slideshow speed and a button that displays a list of images on the slideshow. The application uses the module pattern for the slideshow object, which lets the application use a single object with private state, and it also allows the code to be split among multiple files. All right. The application uses accessor properties to access the slideshow's private state. Now, they show you the HTML here on page 565. In the head section, you can see 3 script elements in addition to the script element for the jQuery CDM. First, the library _slideshow.js contains the code that creates the namespace for the application as well as the module itself. So that one has to be loaded first of the 3. Second, the library slideshow enhancements.js contains the code that augments the slideshow module, so that one is loaded second. Third, since the main JavaScript file uses the module that's created in the first file and the one that's augmented in the second, it's loaded last. The body of the HTML is pretty much the same as what we saw earlier. The slideshow library, which is on page 567 in the book, creates the MyApp namespace and then adds the slideshow object to it using an IIFE in the module pattern. The private speed and image cache variables are accessible only through the accessor properties created by the object that's passed to it by the second parameter of the create method. So you've got some control over it. The enhancements file, which is shown on page 569, contains the code that augments the slideshow object. It consists of an IIFE, and the first line of the IIFE includes a parameter named mod, which receives the myapp.slideshow object when the object is first invoked. Finally, on page 571, we have the main JavaScript file. It starts with a jQuery ready function, which then starts by creating an alias for the myapp.slideshow object. This is because namespaces can make object names quite long, especially if you have nested namespaces. If you store an object with a long name in the variable with a shorter name, the code is easier to type, it's easier to read, and it's probably more understandable. But make sure that make sure you use a local variable and not a global for the problems that we talked about before. All right, we're up to page 570. So for the rest of the chapter, they'll talk about how to use the module pattern to create jQuery plugins. That's the next several pages. Then they will actually show you one that they've done. So one of the features of jQuery is that it provides an API, an application program interface that lets you create your own plugins. Sometimes you just can't find a plugin that does exactly what you want, or what you're doing is so remote or whatever that you want to be able to do it yourself. Since the jQuery library uses the module pattern that we've already learned about, the jQuery object is available in your web pages without needing to be called or created. That also means that you can use an IIFE to create plugins that augment the jQuery object, and they start showing how that works here. The first example shows how to use an IIFE to import the jQuery object so it can be modified. The second example that's here shows how to use or how to make the plugin chainable using the this keyword. The third example shows how to make the plugin able to iterate through all of the selected elements by putting the code inside of the jQuery each method. The fourth example that's here shows how to combine the coding practices in the second and third method as we start writing a plugin. So what they show you on pages 572 and 573 is how to code a plugin that highlights the items in a menu. There you go. The figure shows the HTML for the nav element that's affected by the plugin and the associated CSS. Now typically, if you want to make a plugin more useful, you want to provide some options for it. You might have a default set up for it, but you want to be able to allow the person to do their own thing, so to speak. But it is important that you still have a default, all right, so that if a person just wants to run the plugin in the quote normal way, unquote, they can. To provide options for a plugin, you code a parameter for the plugin that will receive the options the user sets. To set the default options, you can use the $.extend method, which merges the properties in the first parameter along with an object literal and the properties in the second parameter. So starting on page 576 and the last 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 pages of the chapter talk about a Blackjack application that uses a Blackjack plugin. I'm not going to go over the rules of Blackjack. Hopefully you know what they are. But this application uses a custom jQuery plugin to add the functionality of the Blackjack game. The HTML for the file for the application links to the CSS and JavaScript files the plugin needs, and it also includes a div element with an ID of Blackjack. The main JavaScript file then attaches the plugin to that div element and passes some options along to the plugin. In figure 18-18 on pages 578 and 579, they show the library file for a deck of cards. The single property of the deck object is an array of strings named cards. And there are 3 associated methods: needs shuffling, shuffle, and default. Needs shuffling returns true if the number of cards remaining in the cards array is less than 10. The shuffle method shuffles the cards by calling the reset cards function. And the deal method uses the math.random and math.floor methods to randomly select an index from the cards array, which again simulates you dealing. The game file is shown on pages 580 and 581. Since only one game is needed and it doesn't need to protect any private state, it's coded as an object itself. The game object has 3 different properties, as you can see up there. It has a dealer property, a player property, and a balance property. The dealer and player properties contain instances of the current hand or hands object, while the balance is a numeric value that keeps track of the player's current balance. And again, it works very similar to what you would play in real Blackjack. All right, there's a deal method, there's a hit method, there's a player wins method, there's a dealer wins method, and there's an update balance method. Figure 1820 that's on pages 582 and 583 shows the main file for the Blackjack plugin. It's pretty long, so that the basic jQuery code for things like setting text and labels has been removed from here. But the Blackjack plugin uses an IIFE, the module pattern, and the API standards in order to do its thing, so to speak. Finally, they mention, as far as compressing this stuff, that you want your code to be able to load as quickly as possible and to take up as little space as possible. So if you want to do that, it's possible that you can use what are called minification tools to remove white space, comments, and line breaks in the JavaScript to decrease the file size. You've already seen this in jQuery as we've used the minified file. I mean, it's easier to develop and maintain code that's kept in separate libraries, but it's also easier to download and use a plugin that's kept in a single file. That's why minification is oftentimes used. So, I have finished the book. What I plan on doing next is the next lecture that I give is going to be on different editors that you can use. And after I get done with that, I'm going to give you an explanation of the website I plan on creating. It's going to be very incremental in nature. When we first create it, it'll look pretty terrible, and that's all fine. We'll be adding stuff to it as we go on, and we'll see, how it ends up when we're finished. I'll be back to start that all of that stuff fairly shortly.